And can we give another round of applause to Llewellyn King, the king himself?
Thank you very much. Llewellyn and I had argued about who would go first. So the statesman.
And welcome to the stage, John Butler.
Almost go first, always go first. Well, I'm here to think about what Llewellyn has said. Llewellyn, I need to get this up here because I think we're at different heights. Can you hear me fine? Yeah. We need to think about what Llewellyn said in terms of business models. Okay? Llewellyn talked about the state of where we are. Llewellyn talked about what we need to do, talked about how bad off we are, but we've always been bad off. We're bad off when the country started. We're bad off coming out of World War I, World War II, and what has always saved us is the relationship between technology and business models. As a member here, we talk a lot about technologies. We talk a lot about what the technologies can do. And what I add to the group is the idea is how can we commercialize those technologies. And we look at the business models here as we get the next slide. This is what's so different about where we are today. It was pretty easy to do a business model based on traffic because we knew that we had to move from the airplane, from the train, from the covered wagon to the horse, from the horse to the automobile. But what happens to business models when they are entrenched, really entrenched in the technologies that we have today? It is quite different in building a business model related to the utility industry, even related to the movement of communications, such as Microsoft. And I just threw this up here as understanding smart business models of comparison. We are in a very, very interesting kind of time where business models don't necessarily come from the earth, don't necessarily come from the ships and land and sea, but they tend to come from right here. Who would have thought that we could have a great city in a place where there's absolutely no waterways, where there's absolutely no transition to the waterways? Who would have thought that you could have a business model in the middle of an ocean? Who would have thought that? So the changes in business models first has to do with the relationship between demography, that is where we go, how we live, and right now people are saying, well, the demography is changing. The whole idea that distributive work will replace our kind of work. And add to that, as we say on the next slide, I'm just throwing some slides up here, add to that the whole idea of how those things get conceptualized and how we think about how to make money off of new technologies. I'm not talking about the technology itself. There are millions and millions of technologies and inventions sitting on the shelf. And the question is, can you be smart enough to take all the data that we've talked about? Can you be smart enough to take all of the airplanes that we've talked about that will fly with nobody on them? Can you be smart enough to create a business model around a new level of education? And what we talk about here is the relationship between what's happening in the home, the data that's being produced in the home, as I turn my light on, as I open my door, as I turn my refrigerator on, as I turn my air conditioner on. So therefore, the business models today are very, very different. If you look at this slide, if you can see this slide, this just has a car, an automobile, and all of the smart businesses and all of the smart kinds of buildings. Now, of course, we can say one thing and be sort of done with it. We can say that these are just technologies that allow us to get places faster, that allow us to move information faster. But we know what will happen is new enterprises will develop out of the new technologies. Now, me as sort of a professor, I go back to 2000 BC. I look at the relationship with the Silicon Valley in 2000 BC and how business models evolved around the new kinds of minerals. I look at how business models evolved around the new kinds of science. But here, when we talk about smart cities, we have an interesting thing to do. You know, technology is always ahead of how we think about things. And on the best program on television, which is, what's the best program on television? The best program is digital what? Roundtable, right? We talk about a lot of things, and we get a lot of questions about a lot of things. And if we were to codify those questions, it would be this. When you talk about smart cities, you talk about sometimes the lap between of how people see business models and the new technologies that can produce the new business models. We talk about, for example, that the idea is that at a great city council, like Austin, Texas, or Brownsville, Texas, or Milwaukee, Wisconsin, have had certain kind of business models in their head. Well, what do you do when you say you have a smart city? What do you do when you say you can reduce the amount of efficiency or increase the amount of efficiency by having smart lights, by having smart street lights? What about smart curves? What about driving into town and having smart kinds of places where people can learn to eat? Because what we see is the business models will relate to the service that the cities will give their citizens. Other business models, like a Microsoft, relates to the people who own the shares. A big difference then is that the shareholders then, people who must be pleased, are the people in the city. But at the very, very same time, you have an idea of, at the very, very center, in creating those new business models. I got 2 minutes, so let me just say, well, I got 4 minutes because he took 5 of mine. Let us take an example of how business models might be in the future, changing with technologies. So I came down here on Uber this morning. We had a big wreck on Mopac. But we know that in the near future, I can just fly down here. Oh, we talk about creative destruction and how things change. But you have to figure out the business model would be getting the lanes of flight, how you flight, changing all of the buildings so that you can land. And so consequently, you have a very, very interesting type of business models. And the great thing about it is, all of those business models will be equations. I'm going to say that again. All of the business models and how you think about the business models, next slide please, would probably be equations. Okay? Oops. Would probably be equations. There we go, that's good. What does equations mean? Equations mean that for the first time in our history, just the military would not defend on breaking a code. For the first time in our history, we have a sense that people have to be smart enough, they might call them data scientists, to understand what the data are saying and how the business models can be created. That is, how can we create business models from the data? So when Andreas logged on in the morning, he said, I think I want a new shirt. He comes back the next day, he's got 15,000 shirts looking at him. When students at the University of Texas would say, well, Dr. Butler, you know, I think that it's going to rain tomorrow. Why can't we go to class on Zoom? Why do we have to be in person? What happens to all the restaurants? What happens to all the dormitories? You got to create a new kind of business models. So all of the things that we've talked about and examples that we can talk about mean taking smart cities, smart technologies, and not just looking at them and say we have a smart city, but looking at them, and the city council has to be smart enough to understand a major component that we always talk about. Cities now sit on platforms. In all my talks, I said the biggest change is that Dallas and Houston and San Antonio will all sit on a platform and can interact with each other at any time and create all different kinds of business models. That means students at the University of Texas can have classes with students at Rice. Students at Rice can have classes with students at Stanford. Students at Stanford can have classes with the little bitty school in the inner city, Harvard University, okay? But you have to be smart enough to ask one question. How will revenue flow from these new technologies? What does it mean for the utility industry, for example, to know everything about your house, and Richard will get us to the edge out there, right? What does it mean from a business point of view? Does it mean, as I like to say, if my lights come on at 12:30 every night, I can go to the insurance people and say there's a health problem here in this home? If I can say that I have all the data and all the telephone technologies that's calling the medical events, that I can use that for underwriting? Does it mean that when somebody breaks in my house, I can use that for underwriting? Does it mean that when my car breaks down in certain kind of areas and I have all of that data that's very, very small, it's going directly to the dealerships? Does it mean that when I try on clothing, they understand and can predict the kind of clothing I'm going to wear? And for cities, it simply means, how do you make money on the new technology? We spend a lot of time talking about the new technologies. But remember this, always create the business models. We created a business model for the telegraph, created a business model for the train, for the airplane, for the computer. And remember when they first came out, what did they say? What did they say? Everybody knows that. When they asked Ford, what do your customers want? What did he say? I want a faster horse. Because they could not see the business model. So in conclusion, when you look at everything that we're talking about here, and you look at all the things here, every new technology has to be commercialized. And let me just say my book, Global Issues in Technology Transfer, you know, I would never give an advertisement. It's only cost $150. But if you really want to learn about it, check that book out. I only have a 16. I'm like Andreas, who have, how many, Andreas? Too many to count. 44. Okay? So the thing that you take away from a conference like this is, hey, new technologies, as Llewellyn says, lots of problems to solve. And we have always solved them in America. And the question is, would China solve them before us? Thank you very much.